Miss Marple and the Murder of Inspector Slack's Informant. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I want to begin by saying how truly grateful I am for each of you who chooses to spend your time here. It warms my heart to know that these stories bring comfort and joy to such a wonderful community of listeners. Preparing every mystery takes time and care, but seeing how much you enjoy them makes it all worthwhile. It means the world to me that our little community continues to grow, and I'm delighted that so many of you are part of it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more stories to enjoy together. Chapter 1: A Note to Inspector Slack. The early October evening had settled over Much Benham with that particular quality of English twilight that seems to hold both promise and melancholy in equal measure. Inspector Slack sat in the small parlor of the Blue Boar, his sturdy frame hunched over a pint of bitter that had grown lukewarm while he brooded over the day's proceedings. The inspector was not a man given to brooding as a rule, preferring action to contemplation, but the plain envelope that had arrived that afternoon continued to trouble him in ways he could not quite articulate. The envelope bore no postmark, having been delivered by hand to Mrs. Partwell, the landlady of the Blue Boar, who had accepted it with the incurious efficiency of one accustomed to the small mysteries of village life. Inside, written in a careful hand on ordinary writing paper, was a message that had caused Inspector Slack's jaw to tighten with something approaching anger. Inspector Slack to meet Nightingale by the Much Benham telephone kiosk 9:15 p.m. regarding coupons and the Red Lion. The word secret did not appear anywhere in the brief communication, yet it hung over the message like a reproach. Inspector Slack prided himself on conducting his investigations in a straightforward manner, with no truck for the sort of cloak-and-dagger nonsense that belonged in penny novels rather than proper police work. Yet here he was drawn into what could only be described as a clandestine meeting with an informant who chose to identify himself with the code name Nightingale. The matter of the coupons and the Red Lion was one that had been occupying the inspector's attention for several weeks now. There had been whispers, the sort of half-heard conversations that ceased abruptly when a uniform appeared, of a small but persistent illegal betting operation centered around football pools. Nothing grand or sophisticated, merely the sort of petty criminality that skimmed a percentage from the innocent flutter of village folk who hoped for a windfall from their weekly investment in optimism. The Red Lion public house, with its genial landlord, Mr. Tukes, had featured in several of these whispered conversations. Tukes himself was well regarded in Much Benham, a portly man with a ready smile and a talent for remembering his customers' preferences in both drink and conversation. The notion that such a pillar of the community might be involved in anything irregular seemed almost absurd. Yet Inspector Slack had learned long ago that appearances in village life could be more deceptive than a London fog. Inspector Slack glanced at his watch and saw that it was already past 9 when he had been delayed by Mrs. Peaton, an elderly lady who had insisted on providing a detailed account of suspicious noises in her garden that had proved, upon investigation, to be a hedgehog family taking up residence beneath her potting shed. Such were the demands of rural policing, where every citizen expected personal attention to their concerns, no matter how trivial they might prove to be. As he made his way through the village toward the green where the telephone kiosk stood, like a red sentinel in the gathering darkness, Inspector Slack reflected on the curious nature of village informants. In his experience, they fell into two categories, those motivated by civic duty and those motivated by personal grievance. He suspected that his mysterious Nightingale belonged to the latter category, though he could not yet fathom what grudge might have prompted this sudden desire to cooperate with the authorities. The village green presented a scene of unusual activity for such a late hour. A small crowd had gathered near the telephone kiosk, their voices creating a buzz of excitement that carried clearly through the still air. Inspector Slack quickened his pace, his professional instincts immediately alert to the possibility that something had gone seriously amiss. As he approached the group, he recognized several familiar faces from the village. Mrs. Hartwell from the Blue Boar stood beside Miss Nora Pike, the postmistress whose domain included the operation of the village telephone exchange. Dr. Haddock was there as well, his medical bag in hand and his usually cheerful countenance grave with concern. "Inspector?" called out Mrs. Hartwell, her voice carrying a note of relief. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. There's been an accident. Or perhaps, well, I'm sure I don't know what to think." Inspector Slack pushed through the small crowd and peered into the telephone kiosk. Inside, crumpled in the confined space like a discarded marionette, lay the body of a young woman. Her right hand was flung toward the coin return mechanism, and her face, turned slightly toward the light, was recognizable despite the circumstances. "Betty Lane," he said quietly, the name emerging as both identification and lament. Betty Lane, the quick-witted barmaid from the Red Lion, whose sharp eyes and sharper ears had made her privy to more village secrets than any person had a right to know. Betty Lane, who served behind the bar with a smile that could charm information from the most tight-lipped customer. Betty Lane, whom Inspector Slack now realized must have been his mysterious informant, his nightingale. The inspector's jaw set hard as he absorbed the implications of the scene before him. His secret meeting had indeed taken place, but not in the manner either participant had anticipated. Instead of receiving information that might have unraveled a small criminal enterprise, he was faced with what appeared to be the death of his informant under circumstances that would require the most careful investigation. Dr. Haddock approached with the measured tread of one bearing serious news. "I've had a preliminary look, Inspector," he said in the quiet tone he reserved for such occasions. "It appears to be some form of sudden collapse, though there are certain aspects that puzzle me. Perhaps we might speak privately." Inspector Slack nodded grimly and followed the doctor a short distance from the crowd. Behind them, the red telephone kiosk glowed under its internal light, transformed from a mundane piece of village furniture into something far more sinister. The inspector could not shake the feeling that Betty Lane's death was connected to the information she had promised to share, and that her silence now was exactly what someone had intended to achieve. The game, as they said, was afoot. Chapter 2: Death in the Telephone Kiosk. Dr. Haddock's examination, conducted with the methodical precision that had served much Benham well for over 2 decades, revealed details that served only to deepen the mystery surrounding Betty Lane's untimely demise. The doctor's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he knelt beside the still form in the cramped confines of the telephone kiosk, his initial findings creating more questions than they answered. "The cause appears to be sudden collapse," Dr. Haddock reported to Inspector Slack in the measured tones he employed when delivering unwelcome news. "However, there are several peculiarities that give me pause." He indicated Betty's right hand with careful precision. "Note this burn mark on the pad of her thumb, Inspector. It's quite distinct, a small blister that suggests contact with something heated, though what that might have been is unclear." Inspector Slack leaned closer, his trained eye taking in the details that Dr. Haddock indicated. The burn was indeed peculiar, roughly circular and clearly defined against Betty's pale skin. More disturbing still was the faint singe mark visible on her inner palm, as though she had grasped something that had delivered an unexpected shock. Could this be the result of an electrical contact? The inspector inquired, though even as he asked the question he found himself puzzled by the implications. The telephone kiosk, while hardly a marvel of modern engineering, was surely designed with adequate safeguards against such occurrences. Dr. Haddock nodded gravely. That would be my initial assessment. Some form of electrical shock, though whether it was sufficient to cause her collapse is another matter entirely. The girl had a sound constitution, Inspector. I've known her since childhood, and she was never one to succumb easily to physical distress. As the two men conversed, Inspector Slack became aware of a gentle presence at his shoulder. Miss Jane Marple, that elderly spinster whose hobby of observing human nature had proven remarkably useful in past investigations, had arrived upon the scene with a quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize all her movements. She stood now with Lady Bantry, her dear friend Dolly, both women maintaining the respectful distance that tragedy demanded, while clearly absorbing every detail with sharp, intelligent eyes. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack acknowledged with a nod that conveyed both recognition and resignation. Experience had taught him that the elderly lady's involvement in such matters was as inevitable as the sunrise, and considerably more useful than he cared to admit publicly. Such a dreadful business. Inspector, Miss Marple replied in her gentle voice, though her pale blue eyes were already conducting their own examination of the scene. Poor Betty was such a lively girl, always ready with a cheerful word and a willing spirit. Miss Nora Pike, the postmistress, whose domain encompassed the village's communication with the wider world, approached the group with information that promised to shed some light on Betty's final moments. Missy Pike was a woman of middle years whose efficiency in managing both the postal service and the telephone exchange had earned her the respect of the entire community. I should mention, Inspector, Miss Pike said, consulting the small notebook she invariably carried, that Betty placed a call from this very kiosk at 12 minutes past 9 this evening. According to my records, she attempted to reach the Blue Boar Exchange, though the connection was never completed. Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose at this intelligence. The Blue Boar? That would be my lodging. Indeed, sir. The call lasted approximately 3 minutes, during which time the connection remained open but unestablished. Subsequently, she attempted to reach the police station with similar results. Miss Pike's precise manner of speaking reflected the careful attention to detail that her position demanded. She meant to speak to me, Inspector Slack muttered, the implications of this revelation settling heavily upon his shoulders. Betty Lane had indeed been his nightingale, and her final act had been an attempt to fulfill the promise contained in that anonymous note. While the inspector absorbed this information, Miss Marple had moved closer to the telephone kiosk, her attention focused upon details that might escape less observant eyes. The interior of the kiosk, illuminated by its steady lamp, presented a scene that spoke of sudden tragedy. Yet Miss Marple's examination revealed inconsistencies that warranted closer scrutiny. How curious, she murmured, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd that had gathered to witness this disruption of their peaceful evening. Her pale eyes had fixed upon the coin return flap, that small brass mechanism that allowed callers to retrieve unused coins from the telephone's mechanism. The flap itself bore a mark that was almost insignificant, a tiny discoloration that might have been dismissed as ordinary wear were it not for its distinctive appearance. The mark was blue-black in nature, as though the brass had been subjected to intense heat for a brief period. More intriguing still was the condition of Betty's glove, the fingertip, of which showed evidence of having been scorched through by contact with some heated surface. Inspector, Miss Marple said quietly, drawing attention to her discoveries without disturbing the dignity of the scene. I wonder if you might observe this particular detail. She indicated the coin return flap with a gesture that was both respectful and purposeful. Inspector Slack examined the mechanism as indicated, his practical mind immediately grasping the significance of what Miss Marple had observed. The evidence of heat damage was unmistakable, though its source remained mysterious. There's something else, Miss Marple continued, her examination revealing additional anomalies. The floor of the telephone kiosk, which should have been covered by the rubber mat that provided both comfort and safety for users, was conspicuously bare. "I believe there is usually a rubber mat in these installations," she observed mildly. Dr. Haddock, who had completed his preliminary examination, rejoined the group with additional observations that served to complicate rather than clarify the situation. "The pattern of the injuries suggests sudden electrical shock," he reported, though the source of such a shock in this environment is far from obvious. Lady Bantry, who had been maintaining her customary role as Miss Marple's companion and occasional chronicler, ventured her own recollection. "I'm quite certain there has always been a rubber mat in that kiosk, Jane. Rather a shabby thing, but it's been there for years." The accumulating evidence painted a picture that was both disturbing and perplexing. Betty Lane had died from what appeared to be electrical shock, sustained while attempting to make a telephone call that would have connected her with Inspector Slack. The source of the electrical charge remained unknown, as did the explanation for the missing rubber mat that might have provided protection from such a hazard. As the evening progressed and the necessary arrangements were made for Betty's remains, Inspector Slack found himself confronting a mystery that seemed to grow more complex with each new detail. His informant was dead, her information forever silenced, and the circumstances of her death suggested a deliberate act rather than a tragic accident. The game, indeed, had taken a most sinister turn. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices a blister. The dispersal of the crowd had left the village green strangely quiet, save for the small group that remained to conduct a more thorough examination of the scene. Miss Marple, with the patient determination that characterized her approach to all puzzles, had requested permission to observe more closely the interior of the telephone kiosk before any disturbance might alter the evidence that lay waiting to be discovered. Inspector Slack, though privately skeptical of amateur detection, had learned through bitter experience that Miss Marple's observations possessed an uncanny accuracy that professional training sometimes failed to achieve. He watched now as the elderly lady approached the kiosk with the reverent care one might reserve for entering a church, her movements deliberate and respectful of the tragedy that had occurred within those crimson walls. Miss Marple knelt beside the spot where Betty Lane had fallen, her examination proceeding with methodical precision. The confined space of the telephone kiosk presented challenges to thorough investigation, yet she managed to position herself in such a manner that every detail might be observed without disturbing the essential character of the scene. "The positioning is quite significant," she murmured, more to herself than to her audience. "Poor Betty appears to have been reaching for the coin return mechanism when the tragedy occurred. Her posture suggests sudden incapacitation rather than gradual collapse. Her pale eyes, sharpened by decades of careful observation of human nature and its manifestations, moved systematically across the interior surfaces of the kiosk. The brass fittings, the wooden frame, the various mechanical components that enabled communication with the outside world, all received her careful attention, as though she were reading a story written in metal and wood, rather than words upon paper. The coin slot, escutcheon, that decorative plate surrounding the mechanism where callers inserted their payment, bore traces of what appeared to be graphite rather than the oil one might expect to find on such machinery. Miss Marple touched the surface with delicate fingertips, noting the dry, powdery texture that distinguished this substance from the lubricants typically employed in mechanical maintenance. "How peculiar," she observed quietly. "One would expect to find oil upon such mechanisms, not graphite. The maintenance of telephone equipment surely requires different materials entirely." Her attention then turned to the coin return flap itself, that small brass plate, which had already revealed evidence of heat damage during Dr. Haddock's examination. As she leaned closer, her sensitive nose detected an odor that seemed distinctly out of place in such surroundings. The sharp, clean scent of fresh varnish. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying a note of quiet urgency. "I wonder if you might confirm what I believe I'm detecting here." She indicated the coin return flap with a gesture that invited closer examination. Inspector Slack, responding to the gravity in her tone, positioned himself to examine the area she had indicated. The scent was indeed present, though so faint as to be easily overlooked amid the various odors that naturally accumulated in a public facility. "Varnish," he confirmed, his professional interest now fully engaged. "Fresh varnish, I should say, and recently applied." Miss Marple nodded with the satisfaction of having her observation corroborated. She then directed her attention to the small tray beneath the coin return mechanism, where a single shilling lay waiting to be retrieved. The coin itself presented an anomaly that would have escaped less careful scrutiny. Its rim bore a slight tackiness that spoke of recent contact with some adhesive substance. "The shilling appears to have been treated with something," she noted, lifting the coin with careful fingers and examining its surface in the light cast by the kiosk's lamp. "There is a residual stickiness that suggests deliberate application of some substance designed to cause adherence." Lady Bantry, who had maintained her position as interested observer throughout these proceedings, ventured a question that reflected her growing bewilderment at the accumulating mysteries. "But whatever could be the purpose of such peculiar modifications, Jane? Surely telephone equipment functions perfectly well without the addition of varnish and sticky substances." Miss Marple's examination continued with undiminished thoroughness. Her attention now focused upon the lower portions of the kiosk's interior. The skirting, where it met the lamp standard that provided illumination for nighttime callers, bore a faint scratch that appeared fresh, as though some implement had been drawn across its surface in the process of installation or adjustment. "The scratch suggests recent interference with the lamp fitting," she observed, tracing the mark with her finger. "Such damage would naturally occur if someone had found it necessary to adjust the electrical connections." Moving her examination to the exterior of the kiosk, Miss Marple discovered additional evidence of recent activity. The baseboard, which formed the foundation of the structure, showed traces of paint that appeared newer than the surrounding surfaces, as though some repair or modification had been undertaken with materials that did not perfectly match the original finish. The accumulation of these seemingly minor anomalies began to form a pattern that suggested deliberate alteration of the telephone kiosk's normal configuration. "Miss E." Marple straightened from her examination with the air of one who had discovered information of considerable significance, though she refrained from drawing immediate conclusions that might prove premature. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that those who knew her had learned to respect, "I believe it would be most instructive to determine whether anyone has undertaken maintenance work upon this kiosk recently. The evidence suggests considerable interference with its normal operation." Inspector Slack, whose practical mind had been following Miss Marple's observations with growing understanding, nodded grimly. "Craddock," he said shortly. "Alfred Craddock handles all the electrical work in the village, including the telephone equipment." The name brought immediate recognition from those present. Alfred Craddock, known to all as Alf, served the community as electrician and general maintenance man, his services extending to everything from domestic repairs to the upkeep of public facilities. His competence in such matters was well established, as was his reputation for thoroughness in all his professional endeavors. "Then perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, with characteristic diplomacy, "it might prove beneficial to speak with Mr. Craddock regarding any recent work he may have performed upon this particular installation." The suggestion carried the weight of obvious necessity, Yet Miss Marple's manner of presenting it allowed Inspector Slack to feel that the initiative remained his own. Such tact, born of long experience in managing the delicate balance between official authority and amateur assistance, had served her well in previous investigations. As the small group prepared to depart the scene, Miss Marple cast one final glance at the telephone kiosk that had become the center of their attention. The red structure, so familiar a part of village life, now seemed transformed by the tragedy it contained and the mysteries it had revealed. The questions multiplied faster than the answers, but Miss Marple's methodical approach had established a foundation upon which further investigation might build. Chapter 4. The Rubber Mat That Vanished. The following morning brought with it that peculiar clarity of thought that often accompanies the aftermath of tragic events, as though the mind, having absorbed the initial shock, becomes better equipped to examine the details that confusion had previously obscured. Miss Marple, seated in Lady Bantry's comfortable morning room with a cup of properly brewed tea before her, found herself reviewing the events of the previous evening with renewed attention to their significance. Lady Bantry, whose memory for village minutiae rivaled that of the most dedicated chronicler, had awakened with a clear recollection that proved highly relevant to the mystery at hand. The missing rubber mat from the telephone kiosk, which had struck Miss Marple as significant during her examination of the scene, had indeed been a permanent fixture of that installation for as long as anyone could remember. "I'm absolutely certain about that, Mat. Jane," Lady Bantry declared, with the confidence of one whose observations were rarely questioned. "It was a dreadful, shabby thing, ribbed and worn, but it had been there for years. I've used that telephone myself on numerous occasions, and the mat was always present, always in exactly the same position on the floor." This confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions regarding the mat's absence provided another piece of evidence that the telephone kiosk had been deliberately altered prior to Betty Lane's fatal encounter with its modified mechanisms. The question that naturally arose was the identity of the person responsible for removing what might have served as protection against electrical hazards. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Nora Pike, the postmistress, whose official duties had brought her to Gossington Hall on business related to the postal delivery schedule. Miss Pike's arrival proved fortuitous, as her intimate knowledge of village affairs extended to matters of maintenance and repair that might otherwise have escaped attention. "I trust I'm not intruding," Miss Pike said with a careful courtesy that characterized her interactions with the gentry. "But I thought you might wish to know that I spoke with Alfred Craddock this morning regarding the telephone kiosk incident." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision, her attention immediately focused upon this development. "Indeed, Miss Pike, I'm certain any information regarding Mr. Craddock's activities would prove most illuminating." "According to Alf," Miss Pike continued, consulting the small notebook that seemed to be a permanent appendage, "he removed the rubber mat from the kiosk yesterday afternoon for the purpose of airing it. He mentioned that it had become rather unpleasant and required attention." Lady Bantry's eyebrows rose at this intelligence. "Airing in October? How very peculiar. I should have thought such maintenance would be more appropriately undertaken during warmer weather." Miss Marple, whose understanding of human nature extended to the various excuses people employed to justify unusual behavior, found herself skeptical of this explanation. The timing of the mat's removal, occurring as it did on the very day of Betty Lane's death, suggested planning rather than spontaneous attention to cleanliness. Their contemplation of this development was enhanced by the arrival of Mr. Tukes, the genial publican of the Red Lion, whose concern for the tragic events affecting his establishment had prompted an early morning visit to the scene of the incident. His information proved to add another layer of complexity to the timeline that was gradually emerging. "Poor Betty," Mr. Tukes said, his usually cheerful demeanor subdued by the gravity of recent events. She mentioned to me that she intended to telephone her aunt yesterday evening. Popped across to the kiosk at approximately 10 minutes past 9, she did, just as we were closing the private bar. This intelligence provided confirmation that Betty had indeed been at the Red Lion immediately before her fatal encounter with the modified telephone equipment. More significantly, it established that her presence at the kiosk was consistent with her stated intention to make a personal call, suggesting that her meeting with Inspector Slack had been arranged to coincide with this legitimate purpose. Mr. Tukes continued with additional information that proved relevant to the investigation. Alfred Craddock was in the snug at 9 sharp, working on one of the gaming machines that had developed a fault with its illumination. Handy fellow, Alf, always willing to sort out electrical problems without fuss or delay. Miss Marple's interest in this detail was immediate and intense. The establishment of Alfred Craddock's presence at the Red Lion during the crucial period provided him with what appeared to be an alibi, yet also confirmed his ongoing involvement with the electrical equipment at the very time when Betty Lane was meeting her fate. The investigation took a more personal turn when Miss Marple, with Lady Bantry's assistance, obtained permission to examine Betty Lane's modest lodgings above the milliner shop. The young woman's room, though small and simply furnished, reflected a personality that was both organized and observant, qualities that had undoubtedly contributed to her effectiveness as an informant. Among Betty's possessions, Miss Marple discovered an item that proved particularly significant to understanding the events leading to her death. In Betty's handbag, carefully folded and placed beneath her other belongings, was a square of brown paper bearing the distinctive tear pattern that indicated something adhesive had been removed from its surface. Most curious, Miss Marple observed, examining the paper with careful attention to its condition. The tear suggests that something sticky had been wrapped in this paper, something that adhered sufficiently to damage the wrapping when removed. Lady Bantry, peering over her friend's shoulder, ventured her own interpretation of this discovery. Could it have been some form of sweet Jane? Young people are often fond of such things. Miss Marple's expression suggested that she entertained a different theory regarding the paper's original contents. The pattern of adhesion and the careful manner in which the wrapper had been preserved indicated something more significant than confectionery, though she refrained from speculating aloud about possibilities that remained unconfirmed. The accumulation of evidence, the missing rubber mat, the modified coin mechanism, Alfred Craddock's electrical work, and now this mysterious adhesive substance, began to form a pattern that suggested deliberate preparation for the events that had claimed Betty Lane's life. Each detail, seemingly insignificant in isolation, contributed to a picture of careful planning and technical expertise. As the morning progressed and the various threads of information were gathered and examined, Miss Marple found herself confronting a mystery that combined human nature at its most calculating with technical knowledge of considerable sophistication. The telephone kiosk, that mundane symbol of modern communication, had been transformed into something far more sinister through the application of skills that were readily available within the village community. The question that remained was the identification of the person whose motive had been sufficient to justify such elaborate and deadly preparation, and whose technical knowledge had made the execution of such a plan possible. Chapter 5. Two Slips. One-hand Inspector Slack's office at the police station presented a scene of methodical organization that reflected both his professional competence and his determination to unravel the circumstances surrounding Betty Lane's death. The inspector had spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the case materials, arranging the various pieces of evidence in a manner that might reveal patterns previously obscured by the confusion of initial discovery. Upon his desk lay two items that had assumed particular significance in light of the previous evening's tragic events. Both were communications from his mysterious informant, the individual who had identified himself as Nightingale and whose identity had now been confirmed as Betty Lane herself. Through the contrast between these two messages provided insights that extended far beyond their simple content. When Miss Marple arrived at the station, accompanied by Lady Bantry in her capacity as moral support and occasional chronicler, Inspector Slack was prepared to share information that he hoped might benefit from her unique perspective on human nature and its various manifestations. "These are the communications I received from Nightingale," he explained, indicating the two pieces of correspondence with careful precision. "The first arrived 3 days ago. The second yesterday morning. Both concern arrangements for our meeting, though their method of composition differs significantly." Miss Marple examined the documents with the attention she typically reserved for particularly challenging needlework patterns, her pale eyes moving systematically across each detail of construction and presentation. The first message, typed upon the familiar letterhead that identified it as originating from the post office, bore the characteristic irregularities that marked it as a product of Miss Pike's elderly Remington typewriter. The typewriter in question was well known throughout the village for its idiosyncratic behavior, particularly the tendency of the letter E to strike slightly above the proper line, creating a distinctive misalignment that served as an unmistakable signature. This particular defect had frustrated Miss Pike for years, though financial considerations had prevented its replacement with more modern equipment. The typing was accomplished using Miss Pike's machine, Miss Marple observed, noting the telltale misalignment that confirmed the message's origin. "I presume this would have been done during normal business hours, when access to the post office facilities would have been readily available." Inspector Slack nodded in confirmation. Miss Pike verified that Betty Lane assisted her with clerical work on occasion, particularly when the volume of correspondence exceeded what one person might reasonably manage. Betty was welcome to use the typewriter when circumstances required it. The second message presented a marked contrast to its predecessor, being composed entirely by hand in the careful script that characterized those who had received proper instruction in penmanship during their school years. The formation of the letters suggested someone accustomed to precise work, with particular attention to the clarity and legibility that technical documentation typically required. Miss Marple's examination of this handwritten communication revealed details that might have escaped less observant scrutiny. The letter N that appeared in the signature bore a distinctive characteristic, a small flourish that transformed the simple initial into something more elaborate and recognizable. The handwriting possesses certain qualities that suggest technical training, she remarked, holding the paper at an angle that better revealed the subtleties of its construction. The precision and clarity indicate someone accustomed to producing documentation that must be easily read and understood by others. Lady Bantry, whose role as observer had provided her with extensive experience in analyzing correspondence, ventured her own assessment of the handwritten message. The script appears deliberately careful, Jane, as though the writer was taking particular pains to ensure legibility. Perhaps someone unaccustomed to extensive correspondence, Inspector Slack's investigation had already established the circumstances under which the first message had been created, information that provided crucial insight into Betty Lane's role in the communications that had ultimately led to her death. Miss Pike had confirmed that Betty had indeed used the post office typewriter to prepare the initial message, working from a handwritten draft that she had prepared in advance. Betty requested permission to type a brief letter 3 days ago, Inspector Slack reported, consulting his notes with professional thoroughness. Miss Pike accommodated the request, as she had done on previous occasions, when Betty required access to typing facilities for personal correspondence. This revelation established that Betty Lane had been the author of both messages, though the difference in their method of composition suggested that circumstances had changed between the creation of the first and second communications. The progression from typed message to handwritten note indicated either a lack of access to the post, office facilities, or a desire to avoid creating a record of the second communication's preparation. Miss Marple's request to examine. Betty's personal effects had been granted by Inspector Slack, and her investigation of the young woman's belongings had yielded information that illuminated the process by which the messages had been created. Among Betty's possessions was a small writing pad whose pages bore the faint impressions left by previous correspondence. The technique of revealing such impressions was well known to those familiar with investigative procedures, and Miss Marple's careful application of light pressure with a soft pencil had revealed the mirror image of text that had been written on the page above. The revealed text proved to be a draft of the typed message that had initiated the correspondence between Betty Lane and Inspector Slack. Betty prepared her communication carefully, Miss Marple observed, studying the revealed text with satisfaction at having confirmed her suspicions. She wrote a draft by hand, then used Miss Pike's typewriter to create the final version. The impression suggests that she was uncertain about the exact wording and wished to perfect her message before committing it to official communication. The discovery that Betty had authored both messages raised questions about the apparent change in handwriting style between the first draft and the second communication. The careful script of the handwritten message bore similarities to the penmanship found on small cards and labels that littered Alfred Craddock's workshop, suggesting that Betty had either consciously imitated his writing style or had received instruction in creating the second message. Inspector Slack's expression had grown increasingly grim as the implications of these discoveries became apparent. The evidence suggested that Betty Lane's role as informant had become known to others within the village, and that her subsequent communications had been influenced, if not dictated, by someone with both the motive and opportunity to manipulate her actions. Two communications, ostensibly from the same person, yet bearing evidence of different influences, Miss Marple summarized, her voice carrying the quiet authority that her observations had earned. The first represents Betty's own initiative in contacting you, Inspector, while the second suggests external influence upon both its content and timing. The pattern that emerged from this analysis painted a disturbing picture of manipulation and control, in which Betty Lane's genuine desire to cooperate with the authorities had been exploited by someone whose interests lay in ensuring that such cooperation proved fatal. The handwriting evidence, combined with the technical knowledge required to modify the telephone kiosk, pointed toward an individual whose skills and opportunities were well established within the village community. As the morning progressed and the various elements of evidence were assembled into a coherent narrative, Inspector Slack found himself confronting the possibility that Betty Lane's death had been not merely the tragic consequence of faulty equipment, but the calculated result of deliberate intervention by someone who possessed both the technical expertise and the compelling motive to ensure her permanent silence. Chapter 6. The Shilling with Varnish. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green as Miss Marple pursued a line of inquiry that had occurred to her during the morning's revelations about the anonymous communications. Her methodical nature demanded that every aspect of the previous evening's tragedy be examined with equal thoroughness, and the peculiar condition of the shilling found in the telephone kiosk's coin return mechanism warranted further investigation. Miss Nora Pike, ever cooperative in matters affecting the proper functioning of village communications, had readily agreed to Miss Marple's request for a comparative examination of the coins typically used in the telephone system. The postmistress, maintained a small supply of shillings specifically designated for testing the mechanism when maintenance issues arose, and these provided an excellent standard against which the evidence could be measured. "I keep several coins specifically for checking the telephone equipment," Miss Pike explained as she retrieved a cloth bag from her office safe. "When callers report difficulties with the coin mechanism, these test pieces allow me to determine whether the fault lies with the equipment or with damaged currency." Miss Marple accepted one of the test shillings with careful fingers, immediately noting the difference between its smooth surface and the tackiness that had characterized the coin found at the scene of Betty Lane's death. The comparison confirmed her suspicions. The evidence coin had been deliberately treated with some substance designed to affect its normal behavior within the mechanism. Using a soft cloth and gentle pressure, Miss Marple began the process of cleaning the evidence coin. Her actions revealed the source of its unusual properties. As the residual substance was gradually removed, it released an odor that was both familiar and significant, the distinctive scent of varnish which had also been detected on the coin return flap itself. "The treatment appears to have been carefully applied," she observed, examining the patterns of residue that remained after cleaning. The substance was distributed in such a manner as to cause the coin to adhere temporarily to any surface it contacted, yet remain mobile enough to eventually drop free under appropriate circumstances. Inspector Slack, who had joined the examination at Miss Marple's invitation, found himself intrigued by the implications of this discovery. The deliberate treatment of the coin suggested advanced planning of considerable sophistication, involved not merely the modification of the telephone equipment, but also the preparation of specific components designed to trigger the fatal sequence of events. "A shilling prepared to stick until released by some specific action," the inspector mused, his practical mind immediately grasping the significance of such preparation. Someone went to considerable trouble to ensure that this particular coin would behave in a predetermined manner. Miss Marple's understanding of the technical aspects involved in such preparation led her to recall certain mechanical devices that employed similar principles. The coin-operated machines that had become increasingly common in public houses and other establishments relied upon precise timing and reliable mechanisms to function properly, and those responsible for their maintenance necessarily possessed detailed knowledge of such systems. "The technique suggests familiarity with coin-operated machinery," she observed, her voice carrying the quiet certainty that characterized her most significant deductions. "Someone well-versed in the behavior of such mechanisms would understand precisely how to modify a coin's performance to achieve a specific result." The conversation was interrupted by Inspector Slack's sudden pallor, as though the implications of Miss Marple's observation had struck him with unexpected force. His experience with the village's various mechanical installations had provided him with knowledge that now seemed highly relevant to the case at hand. The inspector's investigation of Alfred Craddock's workshop, conducted that afternoon with Miss Marple's insights fresh in his mind, revealed additional evidence that supported the emerging theory about the telephone kiosk's modification. Among Alf's tools and supplies were items that corresponded precisely to the materials that would have been required for the work that had been performed. A bottle of floor varnish, partially used and bearing fingerprints that would undoubtedly match those of its owner, sat upon a shelf alongside other maintenance supplies. The varnish itself was of the quick-drying variety favored by those who required rapid completion of repair work, its properties making it suitable for the temporary treatment of coins and mechanical components. More significantly, a small tin of graphite powder, typically employed for lubricating delicate mechanisms, occupied a position near the varnish that suggested recent use. The combination of these materials would have provided everything necessary for the modification of both the coin return mechanism and the shilling that had triggered the fatal sequence. Perhaps most damning of all was the discovery of a small reel of bell wire, the fine electrical flex used in telephone installations and similar equipment. The wire showed evidence of recent use, with one end bearing the bright copper gleam that indicated fresh cutting, while the insulation displayed the type of abrasion that occurred when such wire was pulled through confined spaces. Mrs. Mabel Craddock, Alfred's wife, whose position as telephone exchange operator had provided her with intimate knowledge of the village's communication patterns, attempted to explain her husband's activities in terms of routine maintenance. Her nervous manner and defensive responses suggested awareness that Alf's recent work had extended beyond normal repair procedures. "Alfred is very particular about keeping things properly maintained," she insisted, her voice carrying a note of anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. "He believes in preventing problems before they occur, which sometimes requires more extensive work than others might consider necessary." When pressed about specific details of her husband's recent activities, Mrs. Craddock's explanations became increasingly vague and contradictory. She confirmed that Alfred worked on the telephone kiosk the previous day, ostensibly replacing a faulty lamp and checking the electrical connections, but her account of the timing and duration of this work varied with each telling. Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed additional details that cast doubt upon the innocent nature of Alfred Craddock's maintenance activities. The lamp that had supposedly required replacement was produced for examination. Its condition suggested that failure was neither imminent nor likely, while the electrical connections showed evidence of modification rather than simple repair. The bayonet cap that secured the lamp to its fitting bore fresh marks that indicated removal and replacement, while the wire leading to the lamp showed signs of interference near its connection point. Most tellingly, the insulation covering the C. Electrical lead displayed a small nick that had penetrated the copper conductor beneath, creating the potential for electrical contact under specific circumstances. As the afternoon progressed and the various elements of evidence accumulated, the picture that emerged was one of careful preparation and technical expertise applied to murderous purpose. The telephone kiosk had been systematically modified to create a death trap that would activate only under precise conditions, while the preparation of the sticky shilling ensured that those conditions would be met at the predetermined moment. The complexity of the scheme spoke to both advanced planning and intimate knowledge of the victim's intended actions, suggesting that Betty Lane's role as informant had been discovered and that her death had been arranged as a permanent solution to the threat she represented. Chapter 7: Switchboard Times and Alibis. The telephone exchange, housed in a compact room behind the post office, represented the nerve center of much Benham's communication with the outside world. Miss Nora Pike's meticulous record-keeping had transformed what might have been a simple service into a detailed chronicle of village activities. Her logbooks contained precise notations of every call attempted, completed, or failed during her tenure as operator. Inspector Slack's examination of these records, conducted with Miss Marple's assistance on the morning following their discoveries, in Alfred Craddock's workshop, revealed a pattern of communications that shed new light upon the events surrounding Betty Lane's death. The precision of Miss Pike's documentation allowed for the reconstruction of a timeline that proved both illuminating and disturbing. Betty's first attempt to reach the Blue Boar began at precisely 12 minutes past 9, Miss Pike reported, consulting her logbook with the professional thoroughness that characterized all her endeavors. The connection remained open for approximately 2 minutes, during which time the Blue Boar line showed as engaged, but never responded to the call. This information confirmed that Betty Lane had indeed attempted to contact Inspector Slack at his lodgings, though the failure of the connection had prevented her from delivering whatever information she had intended to share. The timing of this attempt coincided perfectly with her stated intention to meet the mysterious Nightingale, supporting the theory that she had planned to confirm the appointment before proceeding to the telephone kiosk. Miss Pike continued her recitation with a detailed precision that made her such a valuable witness to the evening's events. Following the unsuccessful attempt to reach the Blue Boar, Betty immediately requested connection to the police station. This second call was logged at 14 minutes past 9 and lasted approximately 1 minute before the line went dead. The significance of this information was immediately apparent to Inspector Slack, whose understanding of telephone procedure allowed him to appreciate the implications of such a call sequence. Betty's attempt to reach the police station directly suggested either urgency or desperation, as though she had encountered circumstances that required immediate official attention. Mrs. Mabel Craddock, whose duties as a relief operator had placed her at the switchboard during the crucial period in question, provided additional details that complicated rather than clarified the emerging picture of events. Her position during the relevant time frame had afforded her the opportunity to observe all incoming and outgoing communications, yet her account contained elements that seemed to contradict the physical evidence. "I was manning the board from 9 o'clock until past," Mrs. Craddock reported, her nervous manner suggesting awareness that her testimony might prove significant to the investigation. There was indeed a disturbance on the kiosk line during Betty's call attempts, though I attributed it to the usual mechanical difficulties that occasionally plague such equipment. Miss Marple's attention focused immediately upon Mrs. Craddock's description of the disturbance, recognizing that such technical anomalies rarely occurred without specific cause. Her understanding of both human nature and mechanical systems suggested that this disturbance might have been neither accidental nor unexpected. "Could you describe the nature of this disturbance in greater detail?" Miss Marple inquired, with a gentle persistence that characterized her most productive interrogations. Technical difficulties often manifest in distinctive patterns that might prove significant to understanding what occurred. Mrs. Craddock's response revealed information that proved crucial to reconstructing the final moments of Betty Lane's life. According to her account, the disturbance had manifested as a brief electrical flutter on the kiosk line, followed immediately by what she described as a ghost ring on the station line, a phenomenon where the equipment registered an incoming call despite the absence of any actual caller. "The flutter lasted only a moment," Mrs. Craddock explained, her technical knowledge evident in her precise description of the phenomenon. "It was the sort of brief electrical disturbance that sometimes occurs when equipment is subjected to unusual stress or when connections are not properly maintained." Inspector Slack's investigation of the timing discrepancies revealed additional complications in establishing a clear sequence of events. Mr. Tukes, the publican of the Red Lion, maintained that he had been serving customers in the snug throughout the relevant period, his attention focused upon the normal business of closing time, rather than any unusual activities that might have been occurring elsewhere in the establishment. "I was drawing pints and settling accounts from 9 o'clock onward," Mr. Tukes stated, with the confidence of one whose routine rarely varied from evening to evening. Alfred Craddock was present in the snug, working on one of the gaming machines that had developed a fault with its illumination system. This testimony provided Alfred Craddock with what appeared to be a solid alibi for the time of Betty Lane's death. Yet Miss Marple's understanding of village geography suggested that the distance between the Red Lion and the telephone kiosk would have allowed for rapid movement between the two locations. More significantly, the nature of Alf's work that evening involved electrical equipment, providing him with both the tools and the justification for any unusual activities that might have been observed. Miss Marple's request to examine the lamp that had supposedly been replaced in the telephone kiosk yielded evidence that cast serious doubt upon the innocent nature of Alfred Craddock's maintenance activities. The lamp itself, produced from Alf's workshop with obvious reluctance, showed clear signs of deliberate damage rather than natural failure. The bayonet cap that secured the lamp to its fitting bore fresh marks that indicated forcible removal, while the electrical leads showed evidence of modification that extended far beyond simple repair work. Most significantly, the ivory-colored insulation covering one of the leads displayed a small but precise nick that had penetrated to the copper conductor beneath. The damage to the insulation appears deliberate, Miss Marple observed, examining the lamp with careful attention to the technical details that others might have overlooked. Such precision suggests the work of someone familiar with electrical systems and their vulnerability to modification. Inspector Slack's growing understanding of the technical aspects involved in the crime led him to appreciate the sophisticated nature of the trap that had been prepared for Betty Lane. The modification of the telephone equipment had required not merely general electrical knowledge, but specific understanding of how such systems could be altered to produce lethal results under predetermined circumstances. As the investigation progressed and the various alibis were examined in detail, a picture emerged of careful coordination between multiple individuals, each playing a specific role in ensuring that Betty Lane's attempt to communicate with the authorities would prove fatal. The technical expertise required for the equipment modifications, combined with the intimate knowledge of Betty's intentions and movements, suggested conspiracy rather than individual action. The switchboard records, with their precise timing and detailed documentation, provided an unforgiving chronicle of the final minutes of Betty Lane's life, while the alibis offered by those with both motive and opportunity proved increasingly fragile under careful examination. Chapter 8. The Wire Under the Skirting. The return to the telephone kiosk on the following morning represented a deliberate attempt to examine the physical evidence with the benefit of insights gained through the previous day's investigations. Miss Marple, accompanied by Lady Bantry and Inspector Slack, approached the scene with renewed purpose, her understanding of the technical modifications having evolved considerably since her initial examination of the crime scene. The crisp October air carried with it the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of winter's approach. Yet the red telephone kiosk stood unchanged from the previous evening, its familiar presence now transformed by knowledge of the deadly modifications concealed within its mundane exterior. Miss Marple's methodical nature demanded that every detail be re-examined in light of the new information that had emerged from their investigations. Physical evidence often reveals truth that witnesses cannot or will not provide, Miss Marple observed as they approached the kiosk, her voice carrying the quiet authority that experience had earned her. Mechanical devices possess a certain honesty that human testimony sometimes lacks. Inspector Slack's professional eye had been sharpened by the technical revelations of the previous day, and his examination of the kiosk's exterior revealed details that had previously escaped his attention. The small screws that secured the lamp standard to its mounting showed fresh tool marks, bright and new, quite different from the weathering one would expect on permanently installed fixtures. "These screws have definitely been disturbed," the inspector confirmed. "The scratches are bright and new, quite different from the weathering one would expect on permanently installed fixtures." Miss Marple's attention focused upon the base of the lamp standard, where it met the wooden skirting that lined the interior of the kiosk. Her keen eyes detected what appeared to be a small length of wire protruding from the gap between the skirting and the floor, so subtle as to be easily overlooked by casual observation. "Lady Bantry, would you be so kind as to provide illumination?" "While I examine this area more closely," Miss Marple requested, positioning herself to obtain the best possible view. Her friend obliged by angling her handbag mirror to direct sunlight into the shadowed recess, revealing details that had been concealed by the kiosk's dim interior lighting. The wire that emerged from beneath the skirting proved to be bell, flex of the type commonly used in telephone installations, its fine gauge and specialized insulation marking it as equipment designed for communication systems rather than general electrical work. More significantly, the visible end of the wire showed evidence of recent cutting, its copper core bright and untarnished by exposure to the elements. Inspector Slack's investigation beneath the kiosk revealed additional evidence that supported their growing understanding of how the deadly trap had been constructed. A short length of similar wire lay concealed in the space beneath the metal step, its position suggesting that it had been deliberately hidden rather than accidentally dropped during legitimate maintenance work. "This piece has been cut from a longer length," the inspector observed, examining the wire with professional thoroughness. One end shows the bright copper core that indicates recent cutting, while the other end appears to have been stripped of insulation in preparation for connection to some other component. Miss Marple's examination of the area immediately surrounding the coin return mechanism revealed what she had begun to suspect must exist: physical evidence of the electrical contact that had proved fatal to Betty Lane. A minute scorch mark on the wooden frame, barely visible unless one knew precisely where to look, indicated the point where electrical current had arced between metallic components. The scorch mark provides definitive proof that electrical current was present in areas where it should never have existed, Miss Marple concluded, her voice carrying the satisfaction of one whose theoretical understanding had been confirmed by physical evidence. Someone with considerable technical knowledge deliberately created conditions that would prove lethal under specific circumstances. The pattern of evidence that emerged from this careful re-examination painted a detailed picture of the modifications that had been made to transform an ordinary telephone kiosk into a carefully constructed death trap. The installation of additional wiring, the modification of the lamp circuit, and the preparation of the coin mechanism had all been accomplished with a level of technical sophistication that spoke to professional competence rather than amateur experimentation. Lady Bantry, whose role as observer had provided her with extensive experience in following Miss Marple's investigative methods, ventured her own interpretation of the evidence they had uncovered. "It appears that someone went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that Betty would encounter precisely the conditions necessary to trigger this dreadful mechanism." Miss Marple nodded in agreement, her understanding of human nature allowing her to appreciate the calculated malice that such preparation represented. The deliberate removal of the protective rubber mat, the careful timing of the equipment, modifications, and the preparation of the adhesive-treated coin all pointed to advanced knowledge of Betty Lane's intentions and movements. The coordination required for such preparation suggests either remarkable foresight or advanced knowledge of Betty's plans, Miss Marple observed, her voice reflecting the gravity of this realization. Someone knew precisely when and how she would use this telephone kiosk and prepared accordingly. Inspector Slack's growing appreciation for the complexity of the crime led him to recognize that the technical modifications represented only one aspect of a larger conspiracy. The timing of events, the provision of alibis, and the careful coordination of activities all suggested planning that extended far beyond the mechanical preparation of the murder weapon. As their examination of the physical evidence drew toward completion, Miss Marple found herself confronting a puzzle that combined technical sophistication with human psychology in ways that demanded careful consideration of both mechanical evidence and personal motivation. The telephone kiosk had been transformed from a simple communication device into something far more sinister. Yet the human elements of the crime remained to be fully understood. The wire concealed beneath the skirting, the scorch marks on the wooden frame, and the modified lamp circuit all provided tangible proof that Betty Lane's death had been neither accident nor natural causes, but the calculated result of deliberate intervention by someone whose technical knowledge had been applied to murderous purpose. The question that remained was the identification of the individual whose motive had been sufficient to justify such elaborate preparation, and whose access to both technical knowledge and the crime scene had made such modifications possible. Chapter 9. A Bell That Rang Without a Caller. The revelation that would ultimately unravel the carefully constructed alibi surrounding Betty Lane's death came to Miss Marple not through dramatic confrontation, but through her characteristic, Attention to seemingly insignificant details, those small anomalies dismissed by others as mere mechanical quirks. Her request for Mrs. Mabel Craddock to recount the evening's events once more, this time focusing specifically on the technical aspects of her observations, yielded information that proved crucial in reconstructing the true sequence of that fatal night. Mrs. Craddock, whose position at the telephone exchange had granted her unique insight into the village's communication patterns, found herself subjected to Miss Marple's gentle yet persistent questioning regarding the precise nature of the disturbances she had observed on the switchboard equipment. "You mentioned a ghost. Ring on the station line," Miss Marple prompted with the patient courtesy that characterized her most productive interrogations. "Could you describe this phenomenon in greater detail? Such technical anomalies often provide valuable insights into the underlying circumstances that produce them." Mrs. Craddock's response revealed a depth of technical knowledge reflective of her professional training, yet her nervousness suggested an awareness that her testimony might prove more significant than she had initially realized. The station line registered an incoming call at approximately 15 minutes past 9, Mrs. Craddock explained, consulting her own notes with the precision demanded by her role. "However, when I responded to the signal, no caller was present on the line. The connection remained open for perhaps 10 seconds before terminating automatically." Miss Marple's understanding of both human nature and mechanical systems led her to suspect that this ghost ring was not random equipment failure, but rather a deliberate signal. Tragically misinterpreted, she proposed a practical demonstration to confirm her theory. With Inspector Slack stationed at the police office and Lady Bantry overseeing the experiment from outside the kiosk, Miss Marple stepped inside the red telephone booth, positioning herself exactly as Betty Lane would have been. "I shall attempt to recreate the conditions that poor Betty encountered," she explained calmly. "If my suspicions are correct, Inspector Slack should experience precisely what Mrs. Craddock described. A brief ring followed by silence." Gently, Miss Marple pressed down on the coin return flap, the same motion Betty would have used in attempting to retrieve her shilling. At that instant, the telephone at the police station rang. Sharply, Inspector Slack's voice crackled. "Over the line Lady Bantry had established for monitoring purposes, I heard a distinct ring, followed by silence when I answered. The connection terminated after several seconds, exactly as Mrs. Craddock reported. A heavy silence fell over the group. The significance of the discovery was unmistakable. The ghost ring, previously dismissed as a technical glitch, was in fact the final act of Betty Lane's life. Her attempt to signal Inspector Slack by pressing the coin return flap as they had apparently arranged had instead triggered the deadly electrical charge prepared by her killer. Miss Marple turned to the assembled group, her expression grave. "The signal was elegant in its simplicity," she observed, her voice carrying a quiet note of reluctant admiration for the cunning behind such a cruel design. "Betty was to press the coin return flap to indicate your arrival, Inspector. The resulting electrical pulse would register as a brief ring on the station line, confirming your presence, without requiring conversation. The implications extended far beyond the mechanics of the trap. This method required intimate coordination between Betty and someone she trusted, someone who had convinced her to use this silent signal, then transformed it into her execution." Mrs. Craddock's reaction confirmed the emotional weight of the revelation. Her professional composure cracked under the realization that her switchboard had recorded the exact moment of Betty Lane's death. "I heard the signal," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew something unusual had occurred on the kiosk line, but I hoped it was merely equipment failure." Miss Marple regarded her with compassion. "You suspected your husband's maintenance work might be connected to the disturbance," she said gently. Your silence was not born of malice, but of the very natural desire to protect someone you love. The truth now stood revealed. Mrs. Craddock had documented the murder in real time, unknowingly bearing witness through the system she operated daily, her failure. To report the anomaly, however, understandable, had allowed the crime to remain hidden. But the ghost ring was no longer a mystery. It was a cry across the wires. Betty's last message, received but never understood until now. Chapter 10. Kiosk, coin, varnish, and a live flap. The gathering beside the telephone kiosk on that final morning carried the solemn air of a tribunal, though none had come to pass judgment, only to receive the truth that Miss Marple's meticulous investigation had uncovered. Inspector Slack stood with arms crossed, his stern features softened by grudging respect. The villagers, Mr. Tukes, Alfred Craddock, and others drawn into the web of suspicion, waited in uneasy silence. Miss Marple began, her voice calm and precise, as if explaining a particularly intricate knitting pattern. The method employed was both ingenious and ruthless, she said. The killer modified the telephone kiosk so that the brass coin return flap would carry a dangerous electrical charge from the lamp circuit, activated only under specific conditions. She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to settle. The timing was arranged so that Betty would encounter this hazard at the precise moment she attempted to signal Inspector Slack using the very mechanism meant to confirm their meeting. Her explanation unfolded with clarity, translating complex electrical modifications into terms all could understand. During Mr. Craddock's visit to the Red Lion at 9 o'clock, he ostensibly repaired a gaming machine. In reality, he used that opportunity to prepare the trap. Later, he returned to the telephone kiosk under the pretense of replacing a faulty lamp. But the lamp was not faulty. It was a cover for rewiring the circuit so that current could bypass its normal path. She gestured toward the kiosk. The rubber mat was removed to eliminate insulation. The varnished shilling was placed to ensure the coin would stick momentarily, delaying retrieval just long enough. When Betty pressed the flap to dislodge it, the metal made contact with the live wire concealed beneath the skirting and completed the circuit through her body. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. The blister on her thumb, the scorch mark on her glove, the heat damage on the flap, all consistent with high-voltage contact. And the ghost ring? That was the final proof. The moment she pressed the flap, the surge created a signal on the exchange line. Her last act was not just her death. It was a message we failed to recognize until now, Miss Marple continued, the handwriting on the second note, delivered. By hand, matches labels found in Mr. Craddock's workshop. He wrote it or dictated it to make Betty believe the meeting was still on. Meanwhile, Mr. Tukes provided the motive. Betty had discovered his illegal betting operation, run through the Red Lion via football pools. Exposed, he faced ruin. So he enlisted Alf's skills to silence her permanently. Mr. Tukes flushed crimson. Preposterous. I had nothing to do with— You gave Craddock the idea, Miss Marple interrupted softly. And you provided the alibi. You claimed he was with you at 9 repairing the machine. But the distance between the Red Lion and the kiosk is less than 2 minutes on foot. He left during closing time when everyone was distracted. He returned before anyone noticed. And you said nothing. Tukes fell silent. Alfred Craddock, pale and trembling, whispered, I didn't mean for it to go like this. I thought, a scare. Just to stop her talking. But you knew the risk, Miss Marple said. You're an electrician. You know what happens when current passes through the heart? Craddock bowed his head. Inspector Slack stepped forward. Mr. Tukes? Alfred Craddock, you are both under arrest for the murder of Betty Lane. The formal words hung in the crisp autumn air. As the constables led the men away, Lady Bantry turned to Miss Marple. "It's dreadful, Jane, all that planning. That cold calculation." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, gazing at the red kiosk one last time. "So much evil can hide behind ordinary things. A telephone. A shilling. A handshake. One must always look closely, because the truth is rarely on the surface. It's in the varnish, the wiring, the tiny details others overlook. And with that, the case of the murdered informant was closed. But in Much Benham, no one would ever look at a telephone kiosk the same way again." Thank you for listening to Cafe Tales. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to support our channel. Until next time, stay curious and keep an eye on the little things. They tell the biggest stories,